Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. I'm super excited to have my treasured teacher and mentor, Cyndi Brannen, back on the show to talk about her third book, Entering Hecate's Garden. If you're new to Cyndi's work, you should know that she is one of the world's foremost experts on Hecatean witchcraft. Her book, Keeping Her Keys, was an instant classic. Those are my words, instant classic. That is what it is. She has a doctorate in applied social psychology and an extensive background in the healing field, from academia to health research to her psycho-spiritual healing practices, which are shared very deeply and very generously in her online programs through the Covenant Institute, which you can learn about at keepingherkeys.com. She also has her own podcast called More Than This, at the crossroads of modern life and the deeper world, with some fabulous podcasts there, highlighting favorite goddesses like Persephone and then lesser-known ones like Semele. And they're all shared with Cyndi's unique perspective. Check out the recent trance journey for Beltane she posted, and find it wherever you get your podcasts. So without further ado, let's connect with Cyndi and enter the world of Hecate's Garden. Cyndi, welcome back to the Numinous Podcast. I know friends and fans of the show are as thrilled as I am that you're back, but let's have a reminder. What identities do you lead with?
Well, Carmen, I know you lead with this question in your interview, so I've been thinking about it for the past few days. And so this is where I'm at. I received this really wonderful feedback from one of my students, like in my premium program. And this person wrote to me thanking me for being a good example of the admirable qualities of Canadians in the world.
Okay.
And of course, it was such a sweet thing to say. And I thanked her. And it was, first thing on a Monday morning. And I'm like, thanks so much for starting my week off this way. And for me, it opened up, the container within me, within my psyche or my personality, about my complex feelings about being a Canadian.
Mm-hmm. This is juicy already.
Since you also live in the same country, if we're using that language,
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would be maybe interesting for us just to riff for a few minutes about this. So
Please.
For me, because, it was a sweet and beautiful thing to say, but I never lead with being a Canadian. I never lead with it. It's not even on the list of identities.
Yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah.
So it's like, what identities do I lead with? And, maybe being typical me, I'm like, let's turn the list upside down and go with what's at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, exactly.
Because for me and where I live in the world, I try to be a good steward of the land and to live in consciousness of the history that led me to be a property owner where I live in the world.
Mm-hmm.
None of it, of course, was my fault. I didn't do any of it. Mm-hmm. I'm not responsible for colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
But yet here I am. And here I am in traditional Mi'kmaq territory, living on a piece of land that is still very wild and free. Hasn't been touched, by even something like an organized park, right? You know what I mean? It's very wild and free. And I try to be in communion with the spirits of the land in my best way, very imperfect, very well-educated white woman kind of way, but I do my best. I try, and I'm aware of my limitations. And, if someone said, like, what geographical identity do you lead with? I would say I live on the outskirts of a tiny fishing village that was traditionally Mi'kmaq territory. And then I would probably say, well, I live in Nova Scotia. And, it's not like I don't hate Canada. I don't want anybody thinking like I hate Canada. I mean, obviously, it is a great country to live in compared to other countries in the world. So it's not that I dislike Canada or dislike being a Canadian. It's just for me, it's really complex. And whenever I contemplate how I feel about citizenship, I loop back to that quote. I have like a one-line explanation for how I feel about it, which I'm going to paraphrase, and I'll probably get it wrong. So some people will know this better than me, but I'm going to say it. Virginia Woolf has a great quote that says, "I am a woman. I own no country. I'm a woman. I have no country."
Mm-hmm.
And that I see it that way too. I'm a woman. I have no country.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever this
Mm-hmm.
is, and all the wonders of Canada. It's a great country, not perfect,
Mm-hmm.
but it's overall, we're pretty fortunate to call Canada home compared to most of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't feel like it's my country. At the same time,
I get it.
whenever
I
we
get
sing
it.
the national anthem, I cry a little and then I get irritated because it says God. Like, so it's
Right.
complex for me. It's very
It really
complex.
is.
I don't
I
know.
totally feel you on that. I totally feel you on that. And yeah, I've had conversations like this over the years with like my husband or different friends where it's like, yeah, how would I identify? Personally, I would first identify if I were to be like, where am I of or from? I'd be like, I'm a Southern Vancouver Islander. Like there's a
Mhm.
very particular microclimate living here
Right.
in kind of what I would call, I joke, is the California of Canada, right?
Hmm.
and and yet, even the way we describe ourselves is like a bedroom community of the U.S. We describe ourselves as the Pacific Northwest. We're not Northwest unless we're American. We are the Southwest of where I live, And so, I do feel that imperialism imposed upon myself as a Canadian. It's like, so if somebody were to if I would never have like a Canadian flag or describe myself as a proud Canadian in the sense that I'm like, what exactly would I be saying I'm proud of? Like all I think of when I think of nations is imperialism and colonialism. That said, at the same time, Southern Vancouver Island, where I grew up, Duncan, BC, Cowichan Valley, I compared that even to where I live, Victoria, which is about an hour away. I would say I live in a segregated community where
Hmm.
like white people live in a certain area and the indigenous folks live on reserve or they live out on the peninsula. Whereas where I grew up in Duncan, you go into a classic, anybody from Southern Vancouver Island knows the Doghouse restaurant. It's a diner that's been there since, the 50s. You go to the doghouse, there's couch and sweaters everywhere. It's like, oh, like I go to Duncan for a break from the whiteness of Victoria because it's like, right, I grew up in integrated culture where indigeneity was like foregrounded everywhere
Hmm.
around me. And so, yeah, if I were to describe like an identity, a place-based identity, I'd be like, I grew up in the Cowichan Valley. I grew up in Shawnigan. I grew up in the Southern Vancouver Island. I wouldn't even say Victoria, where I've lived, a couple of decades with a bit of a break in between in Vancouver. That said, I do enjoy in the times that I've traveled in Europe when I've, been with friends. I get along with the Euros pretty well, Like I have a lot of clients that are from the UK. I've led workshops in Finland and Sweden. I have dear friends there. There is something that is not American. There is that. And I will say I have dined out on the not American identity pretty well because there is something about and having studied with Michael Newton so much about, my heritage is Scottish Highlands, about how whiteness was created and the cultural shame was imposed upon the Scottish, who then, migrated and helped colonize Canada and ended up fighting for the fucking Brits that had just displaced them because of that cultural shame. It was kind of like, oh, you can go to Canada and fight for us and you will be somewhat restored, even though we've like displaced you from the Highlands, etc. And it's like, yeah, I do feel that sense of, the Scottish. We were just like looking for a place that kind of felt like home. And a lot of the Highlanders, intermarried with the Indigenous folks because the Indigenous folks could look and be like, oh, look, they dress differently in their kilts and their, tams and all that kind of stuff. And so there was a kind of kinship in displacement that feels not American to me, and we don't have that same revolutionary spirit that the Americans were able to create that led to a kind of manifest destiny. And for me personally, with my bloodline of the Scots, and I know it was different for the Scottish in what became America, but it is like we're still kind of licking our wounds of the wistfulness for the homelands of the motherland that you can never return to. So I that also makes me more Canadian, that sense of like not Americanness and still kind of licking the wounds. That feels very alive for me, Yeah.
That's interesting. So my ancestors were Irish and loyalist, which is an interesting, they were loyal to the crown and
that
founded.
Feels like an oxymoron. Irish
Right?
Loyalist. Yeah.
No, one side was Irish, one side were loyalist.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was like, how did they?
Irish loyalist?
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. I get it. Okay. Irish and then loyalist on either side. Gotcha.
And loyalist.
Yes.
So,
okay.
And so that's very interesting to kind of have that history. And then Acadian. I have Acadian as well. So, it's really complicated, and I really appreciated the compliment. And at the same time, it kind of opened me up to thinking about, would I ever want to be seen as a good representative of Canada? Which I guess in many ways over the years at conferences and in travels, and even in my books, maybe, people do see me as a representative of Canada. But since that's at the bottom of my identity list, I've never considered that. So I really, the kind words were welcome. And also this kind of like reverie on seeing myself like through someone else's eyes.
Yeah,
right?
it is so interesting.
It's always a gift when we can see when someone, says something to us. It's like, oh, that's interesting. This is how that individual sees me. And what can I learn about myself based on what they see from me?
Totally. Yeah. It's super fascinating. Well, and it's so interesting because when I'm thinking about not American, it's such a, there's two sides to that, right? It's like there's a certain kind of pride in like, yeah, I get what they mean by like a certain politeness or a certain hospitality or a certain, we have more gun control, that kind of, we have a little better healthcare in some ways. But at the same time, the shadow aspect is I would definitely admit to the sense of less than, like that America is bigger and better and kind of sleeker and just there's muchness about it, right? So, and I don't sense this interpersonally. Most of my clients are American. Most of my listeners are American. I would not find any difference between us sitting at a long table having a meal, but there is something about America that does feel like the kind of I don't know, like the older sibling. If you had I don't have any older siblings, but I imagine an older sibling who's like 10 years older than you that like moved out way earlier and like is like really established. And you're just like kind of like, oh, I'm over here kind of puttering, doing my little cottage industry over here while you like have an entire career. And like, I would definitely admit to that feeling of like, the perception of like nation states, Canada does feel small and less than in so many ways. I would never be like, oh, but Canada is better than America. It's like, oh my God, we have our own problems. Like, let's talk about white supremacy. Let's talk about imperialism.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, like, for sure. But I can see the compliment that it's like, yeah, we also have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are some things you can do at a smaller scale that are way difficult at a bigger scale. So, but if we're sitting down in a workshop or retreat or at my table, there is no difference between me and an American, as far as I can sense. My dearest friends are American, and
Right. It's
we
same
all
here. And
have the same. Yeah.
I grew up near the Maine border. So for me, like patriotism in the town I grew up in was basically non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
So as a small child, the first acts of patriotism I saw were the very moving, like American patriotism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, of course, and that it is very moving and very beautiful in many ways, right? To
Mm-hmm.
see that kind of love, that
Yeah.
affection expressed for something in a very reverential way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm glad we've had this chat about the Canadian identity, and I appreciate you bringing up, the kind of the Canadian, like that element that we are somehow stuck in constant chronic social comparison with
Yes.
Americans, which you and I
Mm-hmm.
both know from a psycho-spiritual perspective is not healthy. Canada
No,
needs to carve out her own identity.
totally.
She needs some
100%.
individuation, Canada. That's what you need.
Exactly. And you talked about like crying. So I cry in the national anthem every time. I have taken a knee on behalf of, like, again, that spirit of protest that
Yeah.
Americans have that Canadians are so shit at. That inspires me. So, like, I have been on my knee at the Parliament buildings for, I think it was when William and Catherine came to town. Because again, I'm not a monarchist, but I am a royalist. I do know a lot about the royal families because they're real people. And so I'm fascinated by their lives. But fuck the monarchy and let's abolish that. Anyway, but let me go back to so they came to town. We're singing the national anthem. We're singing God Save the Queen. My husband and I are with hundreds on the Parliament legislature lawns, and we take a knee because it's like, yeah, we can't get down with this. That said, at a hockey game, I will stand. Even watching it on TV, I will stand and I cry. You know why? Because of all those parents who were up at 5 a.m. I'm going to choke up right now, taking their kid to the rink to get them. And all the times they've stood and sung the national anthem, to me, that actually is Canada. Canada, to me, is the Hockey Night in Canada anthem coming on, at night, and like running in because Ron McLean and Don Cherry were on, and like Ron McLean is one of the best guys ever. And like, it's like, that is Canada to me, is like small town, rural Canada that unites around. It's a Tom Cochrane song, right? My kid's going to the big league. It's a huge thing. So I think about those prairie boys and those island boys, how many hours I spent at the rink. That actually is Canada to me. It's like small town hockey culture.
That's interesting.
And all the drinking and good old boy shit that goes along with it. You know what? That's
Right.
Canada too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Canada does have a really distinct culture, but I also think one of the biggest challenges for like a Canadian wholeness and identity is that we're so diverse. Like you and I are farther away on this Zoom call, like than if one of us was in France.
Yeah, totally. Than my
Right?
Irish. Yeah, my Irish friends.
If I stayed here in Nova Scotia, and you're further away from me now than if you were actually in France.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure.
So I think our size works against us because I do think here in Nova Scotia, there is a cultural identity here, and I am from this place. Like my ancestors came here, both the Loyalists and the Irish, that to a small island called Cape Sable Island, and I have a genealogy surrounding that, and also the Acadian side that comes from a very specific small corner of this big planet. So I
Hmm.
do feel Nova Scotian proud.
Right. Yeah. Whereas, like, here I am, we're late contact. The indigenous folks, I'm not saying that they haven't had to scrape to stay alive and keep their cultures alive, but actually there was still potlatch happening, it's been pretty intact, relative to the East Coast. So when you have late contact, there is a sense of like, I'm very much visiting here. I'm an uninvited visitor, even though my people have lived in the same valley, or like the same lower part of the island within an hour of here, for 3 generations. It's not, we don't have that, like the Gallic, the Acadian, the settler culture is very
Mm,
different east to west, for sure.
definitely. And
Yeah.
I think like you kind of started by saying where you live is sometimes seen as like the California of
California.
Canada,
Yeah.
but Nova Scotia is very much similar to New England.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
culturally, geographically, seasonally, all the things that are,
Hmm.
it's like we're much more akin to Maine than
Yeah.
like Ontario or Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
for sure.
Canada is just such a big old country
Yeah. Yeah.
that
And there
it's,
aren't as many of us.
yeah,
Americans listening are probably like, oh, well, that's the same as California, Maine. It's like, no, no. But like now make it a tenth. There's just like the transmission and the intergenerational transmission of knowledge just gets more siloed. It's not exactly as uh yeah, it's not an overlay of what's happening in America. It has its own kind of ecosystem. Yeah. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. This was awesome. Thank you for starting us there.
Thank you for indulging me.
No, I love it. It's so good. Okay. We're here to talk about Entering Hecate's Garden, the magic, medicine, and mystery of plant spirit witchcraft. Oh my gosh. I love this book. And as I've told you before, I purchased it immediately because I wanted to be one of the people that was like, had your book as soon as possible and encouraged other people to buy it too. And then I had to set it aside because I was writing my own book and I didn't want to be overly influenced. I was already, as I was finishing up the manuscript, I started mentoring with you and was aware. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of similar things, but your book is going to be one of those encyclopedic tomes that is so timeless that generations of witches are going to say, oh, you know that book, and everybody's going to know this book. Entering Hecate's Garden is like the next generation reference book for both beginner and experienced witches alike, because you have done this beautiful updating of a more, I would say it's like another wave, and I don't know how many waves of feminism we're really into now, but like it's the next wave of really personalizing the deities that we have grown up with, and like you've brought research that is so crucial, I think, to us restoring the place of the woman magician, the woman healer, the woman pharmacist, really.
Yeah.
And so you begin your book with a prologue called Medea's Truth. Tell us about Medea, like who she is and your relationship to her. Why did you choose to let Medea speak first?
Well, I'll just contextualize Entering Hecate's Garden a little bit. I was struck with a translation of the story of Jason and his Argonauts, where the garden, so central to the myth, so Jason is a hero. If you don't know the story, Jason's a hero, goes on a bunch of quests, does a lot of things, becomes a prince, blah, blah, blah. It's a pretty typical hero's journey story, which I'm certainly like I've studied Joseph Campbell and I'm familiar with the hero's journey. And in some ways, I used to think it was semi helpful for helping people make sense of their own narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But several years ago, I became interested in like the heroine's journey, like the female version of it. And there's a lot of feminist scholarship around that. And at the same time, kind of as I went deeper into the work I do, thinking about even the word heroine is defined in terms of the hero.
Mm-hmm.
So what is, and so like my kind of like private catchphrase for these other stories, I say it's a widow of Heracles, it's a widow of Hercules' story, right? You know, because the hero is doing all these things, and there are all these women that are playing secondary roles to the hero in these classic myths, plays, and so on that have persisted for over 2,000 years, right? And so, you know, they're widows, the ex-wives. I just say widows just as a catchphrase for all of those women who are who appear in this story to serve, you know, to advance the hero's work. And certainly in most of the tellings of the story of Jason and his Argonauts, Medea is a figure that emerges in the story because Jason needs some help. So she's there to serve his needs. And they go to a garden where there is a magical dragon serpent that is protecting something super special, a sheepskin. Like you could get it at IKEA. Anyway, but it's a super
The
magical
golden fleece,
sheepskin.
yeah.
Yep, the golden fleece that will give him powers and make him more heroic. And he dupes her into doing what I would call natural magic, pharmakeia, which, you know, is using the natural world to evoke change. And so she charms the serpent, and Jason gets the fleece, and so on. There's a whole lot more to the story. But in the Sun translations, that garden is called Hecate's garden. It's also called Artemis's garden, but there is a whole thing with Hecate and Artemis being very interwoven in different parts of the ancient Mediterranean. That I don't think it's difficult for us to kind of understand because we like to silo deity. I don't personally, but I think in general, we like to silo deity, but Hecate Artemis was a figure. So when I saw that was Hecate's garden and it lists like 60 plants that were in the garden, it was one of those, like I was speaking of Campbell, it was a bliss moment. You know what I mean? It was like it thrummed, it had a life, and it was like, you know, looking at, you know, in that reading what I was reading, it was like a whole garden bloomed out of the book and welcomed me in. Right. And it was Hecate's garden, and Medea was the queen of this garden. Because Medea, whether, you know, Euripides' play or Margaret Atwood did a retelling, there hasn't been a popular retelling of Medea in the spirit of like Madeline Miller's Circe, or Circe, however you want to say it. So about 5 years ago, I was really into Medea at the time. I was just thinking about like because no one had written about her in all of our amazing goddess reclaiming, like you mentioned, like those texts that came out in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, Marion Woodman and Jean Shinoda Bowen, like all of these, Demetra George, all of these women who were out there reclaiming the goddess for us. Me and my stack of books, and, you know, like on the Kindle, like looking through, it's like nobody touched Medea.
Well, because she
did kill
she
her
had
children.
some bad PR. Yeah, exactly. I mean, she went pretty, at least in the tellings, she goes nuts, right? And so, yeah,
right.
but we have a more trauma-informed lens now, and so we can empathize with people. Yeah.
So me, from my trauma-informed lens, looking at Medea's story and wanting to reclaim her personally, I wrote an article back when I used to blog. And I poured my heart and soul into this. You've probably written something like this and you're like, oh, I'm just giving it all. Like, Medea is wonderful. And yes, I know people may not consider her a goddess, but to me, she is. And here's what I believe her story stands for. And I was really excited, and nobody read it. Well, I'm nobody, but you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't a big thing.
Right.
And I was like, I just think that there is so much for us to learn from the figure of Medea. Right? There's so much there. It is a ripe, rich field of trauma, of trickery, of coercive control on Jason's part.
Yes.
And that in understanding what the gaslighting, I'm putting all these modern terms on the gaslighting, the coercive control, the manipulation. He took her from her home and used her in all to achieve his goals. And when she was no longer useful to him, he cast her aside in the myth. That we're talking about, it's a story. So in the myth, he casts her aside. I mean, she even brought his father back from the dead.
Totally. I mean, the woman, she did everything he asked and more.
And
And
then,
he just keeps taking and betrays her, betrays again and again.
And so in the end of the story, I think why Medea gets vilified is because of the infanticide that she killed her children. But from a critical modern lens, understanding both how that story can be reinterpreted from her perspective, and also, in a literary sense, understanding what those who wrote about the Medea figure were talking about. I think she had no choice.
Yeah, what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the movie based on a real life story, Monster. Remember Charlize Theron? Yeah. And I can't remember the real woman's name, but it's like, yeah, we can empathize with these women pushed to the brink,
But I think, but I think it takes a lot of sophistication, and it requires us to be deep into our own healing journey, to be able to say, I understand the Medea character. I understand how, I'm a woman. I do lead with that identity as being a cisgendered white woman. I understand, and a single mother, I understand how a woman could be manipulated. There's the new show on Netflix. I think it's called Bad Vegan, which is a story of coercive control too, right? And you can, on one side, it's like, how could she do what she did? How could she be so stupid? We're always in a rush to call a woman stupid when someone else abuses her, right? If you get robbed, no one says you're stupid.
Swindler kind of stuff. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But if a woman gets into a bad situation at the hands of a man, she's stupid. He's innocent. He can just take his golden sheepskin and do whatever he wants.
Totally. Or if not innocent, we expect that of men.
Right.
It's like that. This is not to be. This is not unexpected. Yeah, that's men. Men will do these things, or some men will do these things, and she should have known. And it's similar to Alexandra Stain when she talks about people don't join cults; they just delay leaving communities and charismatic leaders who lie to them. So it's like these are not dumb women; these are people who have been lied to and manipulated in egregious ways. So yeah,
and and seeing that Medea as being in Hecate's garden, obviously there are historical connections between this story of this great Hecate's garden and Jason and Medea and the dragon, and a parallel to the Christian creation story, right? There are obvious parallels there, and again, thinking culturally, it's we keep in our modern time, we keep retelling the Batman story from slightly different lenses,
Mm-hmm.
so it's like, the ancients were not different from us. They kept making
Right.
a new Batman until they got one everybody liked. Um,
So funny. Mm-hmm.
so, I really wanted to explore that. And in my teaching, we do a lot of shadow understanding. Like we learn to be in relation to our shadow and to not reject the shadow,
Mm-hmm.
not to reject our darkness, but to see us as a blend of darkness and light. And I felt that leading the book with Medea, a very difficult character,
Mm-hmm.
um, would perhaps to see her as like the sentry to the garden, in a way, almost like challenging you right from the get go.
Mm-hmm.
And to set the stage that although this is in many ways a good chunk of the book is a very practical and accessible book of formulas and rituals that anybody can do, but for me, like the Medea introduction, she is the propylaea, which is a term that means both the gate and the gatekeeper. She is the propylaea. If you can't get through the introduction, then the book is not for you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, like since I started teaching in my courses about Medea, she has come through as a spirit that really helps women in particular work with their shadow.
Mm-hmm.
That Medea as a figure is a kindred spirit to all of the times we have harmed others. And, if we are serious about our self healing, then we have to acknowledge the times that we have harmed others. We have to acknowledge that, like Medea, we too may have been duped, those of us who've gone through significant trauma in our life, that we have been duped, and that we may have acted in a way to get out of a situation that harmed others. Like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean, in the extreme, like some of the examples we've talked about, but I mean, like, to hold space for our totality. I think that's what Medea as a spirit does, to hold space for our totality, which is very difficult, I think, because we live in a world that is obsessed with the solar, with
Mm-hmm.
what is bright, with, like we're success, climbing up a stairway, bright, sunny goddesses, nothing wrong with them. I love them. And
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, especially from a depth psychology perspective, if you don't learn to sit down and have tea with Medea, you are always going to be getting burned by too much sun. And so that's why I wanted her to write the introduction, because when you're like, people are like, well, who's going to write the introduction to your book? And
Mm-hmm.
one day it was as though her and Circe were standing behind me at my desk, and Medea just kind of whispered in my left ear, of course, I will, if you'll let
Mm-hmm.
me. So I had a lot of fun with it. I wasn't sure if the publisher of the book would be on board with it. And I was willing to, it be a battlefield for me. And I didn't have, they loved it. They loved
Mm-hmm.
the way it set the tone for the book. And I wanted to write an herbal that really stretched myself. I'm, not a fiction writer. I'm not a poet. Yet, the book starts with Medea's story. And then throughout the book, I have little attempts at poetry. Because for me, the practice of pharmaca, which is an identity I would lead with, but it's been corrupted into meaning something completely different than a holistic practitioner of natural magic that is, rooted in caring for others
Mm-hmm.
and healing through
Mm-hmm.
words, plants, and so on. Like I would lead with pharmaca,
Mm-hmm.
but people think that I'm going to try to give them a new antidepressant if I say that.
Right.
So I mean, there's all this business. So all of that was really present with me in a very tangible sense,
Mm-hmm.
that spirit of Medea.
Mm-hmm.
How dare they? They took what Circe and I were, Pharmaca, and made it into something that is not at all in the spirit of what that word meant to the
Mm-hmm.
ancients.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
a
also,
beautiful way to open.
right,
Mm-hmm.
because, and I didn't want to start with Circe because of the popularity of the novel, which is
Mm-hmm.
brilliant and can't be topped. You know what I mean? Like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always interesting to me that, so I wrote the article on Medea. Before that, a few months, I wrote an article on Circe, who I called Kerke at the time and spelled it with the K's.
Mm-hmm.
Before the novel came out, the novel comes out like 6 weeks later. I had no conscious awareness that this novel was coming. Of course, read it right away. And I was like, oh, like in my small way, I'm riding that current of something greater that is
Mm-hmm.
happening in
Mm-hmm.
our Western world right now, where we are at a place where we are growing more comfortable with complex female characters, and we don't need her to be the heroine in the sense of she's in the hero, like she's in the story with the hero, but
Mm-hmm.
her story is she marries the hero,
Mm-hmm.
or she's a
Mm-hmm.
sad lonely figure,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
Medea, like to know isolation and exile, and to find your place on your island or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's the journey. Like that is, I think, and I try to talk from my perspective as a cis white woman, but for me, as someone who's always felt on the fringe of society and never fit in, that's the journey I'm on, is to
Mm-hmm.
find my own story
Mm-hmm.
in the web of all of us living in Jason's story or Odysseus's
Totally. And
story,
just
right?
in the patriarchy. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. For
my
sure.
own
And
story. So go ahead.
well, I was going to say that, and yeah, goddesses in every woman, that like Jean Shinoda Bolen, when I got to spend workshop times with her, she like, yeah, they've been trying in their own way. I think of a huge influence on my work is Charlene Spretnak, who wrote The
Mm.
Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, right? And so, yeah, the way that we can read between the lines of the patriarchal narratives, the versions, and now we can layer, the research of Maria Gimbutas, and like
Yeah.
it's like generations now of like feminist scholars in mythoarchaeology, and so you're bringing similar work, right? Of like, let's actually talk about who Hekate really was and get outside of Jason and the Argonauts, by the way, all the dudes, Hercules and all that were supporting him as well. There's all these like supporting male characters, but then they all get their spin-offs. It's like fucking Marvel universe of all these people. And we're finally able to have our Black Widows and our, like other characters come forward. So like the time is super ripe for this. Like you said, you're picking up on a thread that has been like slowly trying for like thousands of years. When you talked about the overlay between Artemis and Hecate, it reminded me, I went to a lecture. There was like a traveling lecturer. You probably have read her research, who was researching Hecate as like an Anatolian deity, and like where did she come from before the Greeks? And she kind of described, oh well, the bards at that time would, so all these goddesses are very local and regional, but they would the bards would all meet up at kind of like the Lollapalooza or Coachella of bards. And she said, essentially, they would have what I'm going to call rap battles. It's like,
Right.
well, this is our Hecate, and here's how she behaves where we're from. And like, she fucked your dad or whatever, that kind of thing. And it's like so another bard would say, oh, well, here's our Hecatean type anima mundi type goddess. And like, and they would respond. And this is why sometimes in the end, when you get these like, the Homeric or the Orphic, these things, it's like, well, actually, these are like rap battles and they've been all brought together into one song. And so this is why Hecate can be so many different things. And it's because it was like regional and local. And so that overlay of Artemis and Hecate, I mean, it just makes sense to me, right? It's like, yeah, do we have these like regional things? It's like what we're talking about, what is Canadian, right? It's like, well, are you on the West Coast or on the East Coast? Like, right. How do we bring it all together? So the ancients had the same kind of problem. Like, what's the identity of this deity? And then, of course, we have the Kurgan invasions, and now it's like, oh, it's patriarchy. We're going to reduce all of this to one story. It's going to be the patriarchy story. And now these are all sort of sub characters. And so, yeah, your work I see is very much in the couple thousand year, several thousand year tradition of healers, teachers, wise people who are literally just looking at the original text and being like, no, it's obvious to anyone that she has her own life and why she does this. Like, the patriarchal overlay is so easy to just pull back and be like, come on, guys. Like, she's a much fuller character than what you're trying to say. Like, here's the details, right? So I really appreciate that. And you say that Circe's true self was only fully revealed through triumph over trauma. And so this is kind of what we're trying to do now is like, can we triumph over the trauma of 2,000 years of patriarchy? But tell us specifically about Circe. How do you see her as triumphant?
So, well, before we move on to Circe, I want to show you one thing because you and I are on video so you can see. So when I wrote Entering Hecate's Garden, so I am a mostly plant-based person and generally restrict my use of animal products a great deal. But when I was writing Entering Hecate's Garden, I did something. I reclaimed that fleece.
The golden fleece. I see the sheepskin. It's beautiful on your chair.
On the back of my desk chair as a reminder. Right? A reminder that the patriarchy, for the most part, serves very few people well. We all get caught up in it and can be its agents. And the way for us to use like a mythopoetic perspective and to learn from these stories, whether it's the Marvel universe today or, the Homeric hymn to Demeter written almost 3,000 years ago, is like to carve out our piece of them and claim it for ourselves, because there is so many ways to experience these really rich stories. So I reclaimed and got myself a fleece for the back of my chair. So every day I sit here and I think my work is to reclaim that fleece, to undo the trickery that was done to Medea that made her defeat the serpent, because of course the serpent Dracana, the serpent was sacred to the goddess. And when, so this was, he used her he turned her against one of her allies in that story. And that's, again, that is partly my interpretation, but it's also when you consider the writer, the ones who recorded these stories that come from an oral tradition, they would have well and fully known that to put a serpent there, even and to portray it as evil, that was connected to the sacred feminine. The serpents have always been connected to the sacred feminine, even in the story, of course, of Eden, where the sacred feminine, again, Eve is a Medea character in that story, right? So that's why I have a golden fleece on my chair, because it's like, just remember that you can make a different decision in your life and you can keep the golden fleece for yourself.
Love it.
Do it.
Do it.
Okay. I think a lot of us struggle with that idea. It's like, no, you can keep the power for yourself.
Yeah.
Sovereignty, right?
Sovereignty.
As a symbol of sovereignty, onto our Circe and triumphing over trauma. So Medea's story, in kind of like the way things were told in the traditional versions of the story, there was no triumph for Medea. In some versions she kind of flies off in this awesome dragon chariot, but in other versions she ends up remarried and in a similar kind of shit show. So with Circe, and it's difficult to look at the Odyssey, how she's talked about in the Odyssey and other ancient sources, because the modern novel, has become, so part of our cultural fabric, I think. But in the original story of Odysseus, Circe is a sorceress, a pharmaca, if you look at the actual word. And she is on this island, living the dream, right? Or at least my dream.
Yeah.
And she, and of course there's a different story when she's younger, and there's a problem. But if we stick to the Odysseus story, then she is this character. She's just minding her own damn business. Didn't go looking for trouble, but trouble found her, right?
Yeah. We like her already.
Right? And and so Jason and his sailors show up and are assholes, frankly. And it's her place. Like, they come into her home and invade her space and fuck up her life. It's like, does this sound familiar to like 40% of women? Yes, it does, right? We're laughing about it because we both know trauma, right? Like, we know trauma.
Yeah.
So it's okay. We're not laughing because we're belittling it. It's like, yeah, it's the same story.
It's like, welcome to my childhood. Yeah.
Right?
So, 100%.
So, but through the kind of the classical story, so the men come, they're jerks. She does what I call a revelation spell, where their true nature as pigs is revealed. She didn't turn them into pigs; they already were. And Odysseus stays with her for a piece, and they develop, even in the Odyssey. Like, it's a story where she kind of goes in the story from being naive to clever to wise, right? So she kind of embodies, the triplicity, I think, of feminine, was the sacred feminine. Naive, maiden, clever, mother, wise, crone. She goes through this arc, and because she eventually sends Odysseus away, and he has to go on his own underworld journey. So it's a very crony thing to do in one of these stories, is to send the man onto the next level of his journey. And if he has to go down to Hades town, that's a very powerful spirit that sends the hero in that direction. So for the writer of the story, that progression of Circe would have been known to them, that only very important people send you to the underworld,
right?
But she was traumatized, right? Like, by the whole experience. But at the end, the fact that she becomes the one who says, Odysseus, you got to go and do this thing, right? So she could have, if we compare it to, sometimes in the myth, Medea is her sister, sometimes she's her aunt, it depends, but they are family, from the same family. And, like, Medea was treated very differently and backed into a corner, where Circe had this space to become wise and to triumph over her tragedy. To be the one who sends Odysseus off instead of trying to keep him or harm him. That, you've done your men. We did not get off to a good start here, but over time, she found her footing, and I think ultimately became a sovereign kind of crone figure in the Odyssey, in talking about that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. It's such a relatable content. Um, So, speaking of content, there are so many fantastic spells and rituals in your book. It's an amazing reference book. Um, I personally am particularly charmed by all the references to the Moss Queen. I was like, this is a new archetype for me. Like I've never and she comes up several times. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
I love her. And there is this gnosis chapter where we're like getting into our own relationships. I have a very personal and deep connection with roses. So the way you lifted up roses felt like, oh, like this is a person who really gets there's a lot written about roses, but I often find it's like almost pedestalizing, or I don't know, there's like something that's a bit distancing, whereas I feel a very personal uh, relationship. And so when you illuminated the relationship between roses and Hekate, I was like, oh, this is really special. This is like a unique lens that you don't see everywhere. And then you have very cool stuff like the fierce love potion, which is rosemary simple syrup. Rosemary is, we have a huge rosemary bush outside. It's like a shrub size. It's 5 feet tall, and and my husband and I use that for marriage rituals. We use it for, we'll like cut off a big branch when we prune it in around this time of year, and we like, you could call it fumigate it, or we sane the garden, we like set it on fire, the whole, it's such a dear ally to mine. And then you paired it with Aperol. And I was like, yes, this is like very much my jam. So I had just a ton of things that I was like, oh, these are my new favorite, rituals, allies, archetypes, deities, devas I'm going to work with. It's such a full book, though. I'm curious, what are your personal favorites? What are the things that you were like, someday I'm going to put in one of my books, this thing that I love? And like, maybe I can't write a whole book about that, but it's going to show up. Like, what are your sort of little personal favorite superstars in the book?
It's difficult to pick one because, I see plants as spirits that we can develop conscious relationships with. And I also see the formulas themselves becoming a spirit that has a consciousness. So when you talk about, like the fierce love potion, I'm like, oh yeah, she's a fiery one. And you know what I mean? Like she's a fun, fiery one. And I wanted to include something. I love Aperol. Um, and I love simple syrups. And I thought this isn't a book of magical cocktails, but I want to give like, you can make a magical cocktail. So there's 39 monographs and there's 39 different techniques in the book. So which I think is less obvious because when you say, it's monograph based, it's not technique based, but there is 39 and 39 different ways of working with plants.
It's amazing.
So I love the fierce love potion. I would say for me, because I've been on such a journey with this particular formula, is the death walking oil.
Tell us more.
And sometimes I'm like, why did you call it that? Such a heavy name, such an off-putting name. You know what I mean? Like, but I think perhaps not in a very imperfect way. I was talking about like giving death to the illusion of separation, giving death to a way of being in the world, and walking in the world of spirits, communing with ancestors, going into the numinous, going into Hecate's garden, giving death to like this rational, logical self. Though I don't think I did a fantastic job articulating what I was talking about in the book. But the death walking oil is really interesting. So the death walking oil in my school, my online network, we call it Oleum Spirita, which just means spirited oil. And it's our base oil that we walk all 13 lunar months and we work with it in different ways because we do a plant a month. So we add a plant every month and do a bunch of things. Why I love that death walking oil. Like I remember the first time I made it years ago, it was a kitchen and it still had those coil burners. You know what I mean? Like the stove had those coil burners, and I had been working on different, like a sovereignty oil. I wanted something for me that was like a primary oil. And I am obsessed with natural, like wild asters. They grow, I call my house Aster Cottage. They grow all around here. And I've always loved them since I was a small child and would spend summers at my grandmother's. And so I put aster in it. Most of the other things I think you can buy commercially. I didn't really, like when I made it for myself. And I didn't really realize that you can't buy, like dried aster is not a thing that people can buy. Right? It's not a thing. Maybe a few retailers on Etsy. So when I first decided that this is going to be like the core oil I teach, and even now we make it every fall because asters bloom in September, October, right? So you can only make the thing at one time of the year to make the whole recipe. And you got to go out, you got to do some wild foraging. And the rest of the oil is pretty straightforward. I mean, there's kind of a lot in it, but most of the stuff you can get, it's just like a wild rose blossom. So I can make this out of my garden without spending a penny. And I wanted kind of like the heart of what I teach to be something like if you are a so-so gardener like me, and you live in a so-so climate like I do, all of these things you can grow, or they will be naturally there in North America for the most part, right? So I get really excited, and you can probably tell just by my voice when I start to think like, oh, September's coming, and they're going to be making it again. And, every year, brave souls, like to see them make it. I mean, people will send me photos like that they've done it, on their own that aren't part of the school. But like the brave souls that are like, yeah, I'm going to get me some fresh asters and I'm going to make this oil. Like it does it for me.
I love
because, to get reconnected to the natural world, I think is like, that's the key, right? That's how I do think that's how we really get back to who we really are. So that is my favorite oil. So put that in your calendar, everybody watching and listening.
Totally. I think here where we live, we call them Douglas asters or Western asters, and they're often purples or blues. And there's like a little bush out on the boulevard where I live. And I've actually tried to, sow seeds and just be like, maybe they'll just grow. But actually, I will need to collect seeds and like tend it a little bit more because they didn't just grow as easily as I sort of thought they might.
I do have a student, like someone she's on the leadership team now. She started cultivating asters. Now she's in Colorado, so it's going to be a different species. I think that's the other beautiful thing about asters is that although they are wild, they are on the side of your road.
Yes.
Like in September,
they're like
October,
a ditch flower.
In North America. They are there. Look for this purplish blue flower that kind of looks like a daisy kind of thing.
Sort of,
that there's so many different varieties. So she's actually been able to get it, like she has a healthy plant growing in a pot in her house, which I think is amazing. So you can cultivate them indoors.
Indoors. That's amazing. Yeah, I know you can get seeds from West Coast Seeds out here if listeners are on the left coast.
Yes, and you can totally use the seeds in the oil if you can't, like it's fine. And I also love seeing how people create workarounds.
Yeah.
Like asters are related to chrysanthemums. Can I use chrysanthemums? And I'm like, well, if you feel that's right for you, do it. This is not like, this isn't liturgical. This is my formula. And you can adapt it as you see fit. But I'll tell you, if you go out and get the asters, connect to what aster is and the spirit of stars falling to earth, and just get into the myth of that, what an aster is, it'll transform you.
Mm.
and it won't cost you a nickel.
Right. Yeah.
Well, if
So
you buy the
beautiful.
book. But I
Right.
mean, even
Of
if you're just
course.
listening to this podcast, which costs you nothing, put it in your
Yeah.
calendar. Go find yourself some asters in North America, September, October, and just enjoy
Yeah.
their beautiful. And they're so overlooked. I wanted to highlight plants in the book that have this rich and beautiful mythological connection or folklore connection. Some to get into that, to
Hmm.
be like, look, there is juniper in the parking lot at your local Denny's or Swiss
Yeah.
Chalet in Canada.
Yeah.
They put it like it's there. And
Yeah. Yeah.
like in a perfect world, yes, if you could get juniper, like the juniper that grows naturally here, but like in your world, let me tell you, there
It's a
is
parking
juniper
lot. Yeah, it's a
in the
traffic
parking lot.
island shrub. Yeah, it's a traffic island parking lot shrub. Gas station roses, those work fine for
Right?
different things. Yeah, yeah,
It's so
totally.
in and it's just that disconnect. Like we see landscaping as not magical. Or
Hmm.
even like Bay
Hmm.
Laurel, which has
Yeah,
so much history, so much
yeah.
magic. And people, um, it's everywhere. And then it's like have reverence for
Hmm.
these things.
Yeah,
Like
just because it's in the hedge
2,500
outside
years
your
ago,
doctor's
they were
office.
using them
Yeah.
as medicine. Bay Laurel is crowns and medicine, and it's still here with us today. And we
Hmm.
should hold it in reverence as
Totally,
being a spirit unto itself, right? That means
totally.
something.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I so appreciate that. So I'm curious about what the process of bringing this book into the world was like for you. Like, why was its creation so important? How does it fit into the overall arch of your career? And of course, I would love it if you would tell us what's next for your writing.
Okay, so for this book, I knew I wanted to write an herbal. I've wanted to write one for quite some time. And I had a lot of monographs, a lot of notebooks, a lot of like old, just, coil notebooks with like, lines drawn with markers and the ruler. And then I had developed over the years like written monographs that I would share with my
Maybe you should
students.
define monograph. It's
Oh,
just
yeah, that's
occurring to me. If people don't, yeah, go ahead, please.
so monograph is um, a descriptive article on, in the context of plants. It'll provide you with information about the genus of the plant, its signatures, like what element, what sign it's involved in, and its different applications, like physical, spiritual, magical, and it might also contain like different formulas, different ways you could work with it, and a good one will have contraindications, like cautions if how not to work with the plant, for example. So that's a monograph. It's just basically it's information. It's not There's not a lot of theory. It's just here's the story, here's a bit of background, and here's some things you can do with it. So
Thank you.
that's what a monograph is. So I had a bunch of those, much more than what ended up in the book. And they felt like they had a vibrancy to them. And I only write books that are the books I want. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
so when I wrote the Keeping Her Keys book, there were no books on Hekate. And there really, for me, it seemed like there was a paucity of good books that used like a psycho-spiritual approach that was actually grounded in someone who understood such things,
Mm,
and witchcraft and
mm,
Hecate. And
mhm.
I had a really profound experience with Hecate as a spirit coming to me like kind of out of the blue. So I wrote that book, and then I wrote Entering Hecate's Garden about that. And so I wrote books that I wanted. I think at times people might perceive, that I go around doing rituals to Hecate all the time. You know, that I have this kind of reputation in the world for being this like Hecate and Hecate all the time. And it's like, I see Hekate as a face of a great goddess, but not in any kind of dogmatic sense, So I always find that interesting that, it's like, I'm the Hekate expert. And it's like, well, I didn't really intend for that to happen. And I don't really want to be, I want to be me over here doing my teaching and writing the way from this kind of crossroads of modern life and the deeper world that I'm very much embedded in. I'm a social psychologist by training, and I will always be like a program deliverer, someone who develops a good program, tests it out with people, refines it, keeps going. And we're using a lot of these psycho-spiritual constructs, sovereignty, openness, transformation, and that is what I lead from. And for me, because of what makes sense to me, because of the beauty of the type of witchcraft that feels right to me, the beauty of the natural magic that feels right to me, and the central role that mythology and folklore plays in my personal life. Like that's what I lead from, right? That's where I go. I am not like an occultist. I don't write occult books. I don't identify as pagan. I am I am a social psychologist. I am, someone who is concerned with helping others to have a more meaningful, more fulfilling, more real life. And so I hope, and I knew I wanted to write one herbal. Don't ever expect another herbal from me, because I lead from even this book, although I've certainly know what I'm talking about in terms of practicing plant medicine, that this book is a psycho-spiritual book, right? It takes you on a journey about connecting with the green world that also has these practical things. That's what I lead from. So my next book is actually going to, and the first book, the Keeping Her Keys book, well, I should say that's my second book, because my first book was True Magic. But my second book, Keeping Her Keys, that I really wanted to develop a program that anybody could do that was enchanted by the goddess Hekate and wanted to live a better life. That's what I wanted. So if you wanted an occult book about Hekate, well, of course you're going to be disappointed by that book, because that ain't what the book is. Right? It's using ritual and natural magic and mythology within the context of Hekate to explore who you are and to help you perhaps become more holy yourself, right?
And supported by deep academic research. Like, there's quite a literature review in Keeping Her Keys of, that bibliography is, so let's not undersell that there's also, you have brought another level of, I don't want to say credibility, but I mean another level of resurfacing the depth that has always been there. You go in deeply into the Chaldean oracles. You bring in feminist scholarship from multiple decades. I mean, let's not downplay that book is
right,
like,
you're right.
Yeah, it's not only is it not a cult, it is it's a small little tour de force of both psycho-spiritual, academic, historic, mytho-archaeological research all brought together into like a pretty handy how-to for somebody to pick up, and it's very accessible.
Well, thank you. So what's next? We're going to go into Hecate's cave next. So in 2023, I teach a ritual cycle in my school that is inspired by the great rites of Eleusis that involve Demeter, Persephone, and arguably that Hecate was a very important part of this as the space in between the mother and daughter duo, that she was the guide to, she was the one that was the space in between, which is a very hard concept for us to wrap our heads around. We want to call her a crone, but like to kind of try to see how they would have seen Hekate as not as an old woman, right? But she
Mm-hmm.
was very different, almost like what we might see in Auntie,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
not really a specific age, right?
Godmother, kind of,
Godmother,
which is,
right?
but
Like
yeah.
fairy
Mm-hmm.
godmother, helping
Mm-hmm.
making it all work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we do those. Those are it's 3 rituals. We do them in the school over 8 months. Um, and I also wanted to bring them in a DIY kind of way because I
Mm-hmm.
know the 3 constructs of release, soul retrieval, and psychospiritual rebirth. That those can be done on your own in a caring way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that book really gets into that. There's a lot of uh, depth psychology, of course, in it. And it just go through it's kind of like the how to, like, if you could join my school, like if I would distill it down into 80,000 words. So like,
Mm-hmm.
a sacred daily ritual that sets off the book and so on. So I'm really excited about that book. And then I will, I may, I'm waffling a bit right now, write a final book about Hecate called Entering Hecate's Temple, which will be much more about ascension and becoming high priestess or other sacred title of your choosing of your own journey. So kind
Mm-hmm.
of an anti-hero's journey book, um,
Mm.
with ritual and so on.
Are we
And
back
that'll
to
be
kind
it.
of
That is
Anima
it for
Mundi?
Hecate. If
Soul
that,
of the.
if Entering Hecate's Temple comes out, that is it for books about
Okay,
Hecate.
because you have other things that you'll want to write.
I have, yeah, I'd really like to write. I'd really like to apply my approach to archetypes.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like my kind of, all right, so there's all this mythology and depth psychology, and then there's always going to be me who is like, well, I am an applied social psychologist, so let's make it practical, doable. Let's weave it into our busy lives where we can lean into these things to progress ourselves along our own journey. So it's like the
Okay.
anti-hero book.
Okay. Can I? I'm making a fan request. Um, any kind of archetypes work, and this goes for like you know icons of this kind of industry. Carolyn Mace, wrote
Mhm.
archetypes to all. They're always missing one. And I see sometimes they try to massage into something else. The one they're always missing is the salesman,
Oh,
the
that's interesting.
marketer, and the, maybe that's the business person, but it's not really. It's bardic and business together. There's the salesman archetype as a person who identifies as a salesman archetype and like has
Right.
worked as a salesman in food and wine and spirits and things for a long time. I always feel kind of slighted by that it never shows up. So I think you as a businesswoman and a person with a unique brand and who has been doing it, I can hear right now Frank Sinatra My Way is playing.
Yeah.
You've like done it your own way. I feel like you could do an entire thing on that particular archetype that has been so missing, and like what does that mean, especially as a woman, when we are the inspirers, persuaders, and we get written out of bardic traditions because of patriarchy. But like we did it through songs, we did it through work songs,
Mhm.
we've done it through lullabies, we've done it through bedtime stories for children. I mean, these stories keep getting brought forward. I feel like it's important. So that's my fan request, is that whatever you write on archetypes has this thing about the one who inspires movements and actions, and the kind of Mother Jones type. Like,
Right. Yeah.
anyway, there's cool stuff to be said.
The
That's my
inspire,
request.
I think it's interesting, and this leads me just to thinking about, like, back to how you opened with what identities do you lead with. And for me, there aren't convenient terms for the identities I lead with, right? So I say, well, I would say if the word pharmaca meant today what it did 2,000 years ago, I would never call myself a witch. I would call myself a pharmaca,
Right.
right? Because that's what to me, that's the word that has the most truth. And then when you talk about, like being someone who inspires others, like the influencer, I 100% don't consider myself an influencer. I don't even know what that is.
100%.
That is
Yeah.
people who like get their hair done a lot. I don't know, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, exactly. My nails
I
are
could
too
never
dirty.
be an influencer. I have no sweet clue. I would do better rebuilding the engine on my hybrid SUV than being an Instagram influencer. I like when, like when I've got followers and success, like I do know how to share information in a certain way, but that idea of influencer, like I don't think I'm an influencer. So yeah, that would be interesting, but it would be like, a collection of archetypes with exercises for engaging with them, in ways to work with them. Because like when we talk about myths, or when I reinterpret a myth, or whatever it is we're doing to use these stories to help ourselves understand who we are better, and to perhaps inspire others to find more meaning in their life, like those stories are plucking at archetypes, right? Medea is an archetype of a woman, of the violent woman. So there is that, and she's also the archetype of the shadow self, because for women in particular, violence is something that shoved way into the shadows, right? So they were grappling with archetypes as well. So Medea isn't the end all of the story. She is an expression of something much deeper. That is a universal, cross-cultural, cross times, social statuses. That there is the universal of the violent woman, the universal, like you said, of the woman who can influence others and inspire others. Not a good word for it. That's how uncomfortable we are with it in our culture. We don't have a word. That's how you know when people are uncomfortable. It's not that no word. Right? There's no word for it. We all call ourselves witches today because you know what? There wasn't a better word. We
Yeah.
just reclaim that because that's what we got. Because mediums got a bad rap in the 80s, because of spiritualism, pre-80s. And then, it's like we just needed a word, and we took this one. It's a good one. Because there was no word. Sorceress sounds kind of hokey dokey.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We need more robes if we're going to be sorceresses.
Right? So it's like, we don't have words. We need to just make up words, which I do all the time in my books, because it's like there is no word. I don't even remember what your question is at this point. I'm just riffing.
Well, this is where we're going next. Okay, well, it's time for us to wrap up. I usually ask about grief and rage. I did it last time. This time, I would like to know, where are you finding the most joy these days?
I am finding the most joy these days. Well, for me, this is always a happy time of the year, because a big chunk of my house is full of little pots, me trying to sprout seeds.
Yeah.
So I find a lot of joy with that. I just love doing that. And the plant of the month coming up in my school, the Covina Institute, is my primary plant spirit, mugwort. So I am all in with mugwort all the time. So I'm getting a lot of joy from that as well. And yeah, just joy in moving beyond being someone's mother 24/7. Finding joy in that, right?
Wow, yeah.
It's like, you know what? I can just do my thing. Don't have to drive anybody anywhere. People can all feed themselves and take care of themselves. And you know what I can do? What I wish. It's great.
That is life goals. That is living the dream.
It is, right? Like after you had I had my oldest son when I was very, very young. So I'm just like, yeah, I'm going to just do what I want. I'm going to be
Nice.
here on Cindy's island doing
Yeah.
Cindy things.
I love it. I
No
love it. Well,
Odysseus welcome.
I am so glad that you made time in your life of leisure and writing to jam on the Numinous podcast again. I love it. I love your work. I feel so lucky and honored to know you and have you come on the show and share your wisdom and like get to kind of look between the lines and like really get, between the covers with how your creative process unfolds. I love your mind. So thank you so much for sharing with me and with everyone. Thanks.
I love talking to you. It's always great when we get together.
Oh, it is always great when we get together. I just love our conversations. I'm so glad we got to capture that and share it with the world. Now, to be honest, I don't know what to tell you about show notes because I'm in a bit of transition with my podcast feed and pod site and website decisions need to be made. But for now, I guess we'll say what we always say, which is find the show notes and links to Cyndi and her work at numinouspodcast.com. If one day you find that you go there and you're not able to find them, I'm guessing a Google search will go a really long way. But I will say this, as always, I want to do a listener shout out. Thank you to my listeners in Virginia. This week, you are the global hotspot for Numinous podcast downloads. I don't know, either like a handful of you are absolutely binging on this show right now, or there are legit like hundreds of listeners in Virginia with time to listen this week. I don't know, but there's something numinous in the water in Virginia, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for spending time with me this week. It's totally delightful. If you want to know what I'm up to, follow me on Instagram at Carmen Spagnola. If you want to hang out with me online every week in different online live events, do some group somatics, some all kinds of stuff, join my Numinous network. And if you want to know about upcoming in-person events this summer and fall 2022, including book launch events, sign up for my newsletter. You'll be the first to know. And spots, as you can imagine, are very limited, my friends. To sign up for my newsletter or to join the network, just start by going to my website, carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.